A body hit the stairwell floor with a heavy thud. Snow blew in through the door that wouldn't stay shut, dusting the man's shoulders where he'd fallen. His lips were blue. His hands were locked into fists he couldn't open. He wasn't moving. Then a small woman in a waitress uniform came down the last flight of stairs, saw him, and stopped cold. She could have stepped over him. She could have called someone and gone up to her room. Instead, she knelt in the dark and grabbed him under the arms. Her name was Nora Whittaker, and she weighed maybe 110 pounds. The man she was dragging weighed twice that. She had no idea who he was. She had no idea what that patch inside his jacket meant. What she did that night would bring 40 engines to her door. Stay with me on this one. Now let me back up and tell you how Nora ended up in that stairwell. She just finished a double at the diner on Seneca Street. 9 hours on her feet, and the tips were thin because nobody comes out to eat in a blizzard. She walked the last 6 blocks home with her collar up and her chin down, thinking about one thing: getting warm. Getting up those 4 flights and under her blankets before her toes stopped talking to her. That's the only reason she almost didn't see him. He was slumped against the wall by the mailboxes, half in shadow, and her tired brain wanted to call him a pile of coats and keep walking. But piles of coats don't have hands, and this one did. One bare hand, pale as candle wax, lying open on the cold tile. She said, "Sir." Nothing. She said it again, louder, still nothing. She crouched and touched his shoulder, and that's when he tipped sideways and hit the floor. That wet thud. That was the sound that started everything. Here's the thing about Nora. She had every reason to walk away. She was broke. Rent was 3 days late. Her fridge held half a loaf of bread, some margarine, and 1 container of leftover soup she'd been saving for tomorrow's dinner because she couldn't afford to buy more. She lived alone except for a dog nobody else had wanted. No husband, no savings, no cushion of any kind. A woman like that learns to protect what little she has. She learns not to invite trouble through the door. And a strange man collapsed in a stairwell in the middle of the night. That is trouble with a capital T. But Nora looked at that blue face and those locked fists, and she thought about how cold the tile was under her own knees. She thought, if I go upstairs and this man dies down here, I'll hear it in my head for the rest of my life. So she made a decision. She grabbed him under the arms and pulled. He didn't budge. Dead weight soaked through, the melting snow making his jacket slick as a fish. She got him maybe a foot before her grip slipped, and she sat down hard on the steps, breathing like she'd run a mile. She looked up those 4 flights. There was no way, there was just no way, so she did the only thing she could. She got behind him, braced her back against the mailboxes, planted her feet, and pushed. 6 inches at a time, grunting. Her uniform soaking up the meltwater. Up onto the first step, his heels dragging, his head lolling. She talked to him the whole time, not because he could hear, but because it kept her going. Come on, big guy, you're not doing this in my building. Not tonight." It took her 20 minutes to get him up the first flight. Somewhere on the second, a door opened above, and old Mr. Petrosian looked down over the railing in his undershirt. He saw a 100-pound waitress hauling a bear of a man up his stairs and said exactly what you'd expect. "Nora, are you out of your mind? Call the ambulance." "Phone's dead," she gasped. "Storm knocked the lines, yours." He disappeared, came back. "Dead too, and the plows won't be out till morning." "Then help me lift or go back to bed." "Now, Mr." Petrosian was 76 with a bad hip, so he wasn't lifting anybody. But he stood at the top with a flashlight and counted her steps out loud, and somehow that helped. 2 more, 3 more. By the time she reached her own door on the 4th floor, Nora had nothing left. Her arms were shaking. Sweat ran down her back in a freezing room, and the man still hadn't opened his eyes. She fumbled her key into the lock, kicked the door open, and dragged him the last few feet across her own floor. That's when she got her first real look at him. He was big, not Jim big. working big, the kind of size that comes from a hard life. His hair was cut close and going gray at the sides. His hands, now that she could see them, were scarred across the knuckles. He had a beard crusted with ice, and a face that even half frozen looked like it had been in more than a few fights. His leather jacket was heavy and old and soaked black. For 1 second, Nora felt the fear. Every instinct said this is a dangerous man. Every instinct said lock him out and wait for morning. But then Biscuit came around the corner. Biscuit was Nora's dog, a scruffy shepherd mix with 3 legs and 1 ear that never stood upright. She'd found him in an alley behind the diner 2 winters back, half-starved, his back leg already gone to a car. Nobody adopts a broken dog. Nobody but Nora. That old shepherd hopped straight over to the stranger, sniffed his frozen hand, and then did something Nora had never once seen him do to a person he didn't know. He lay down against the man's side, put his head on the man's chest, and let out a long, low sigh. And Nora thought, well, if Biscuit trusts him, that's good enough for me. She had no idea her dog had just made the most important decision of her life. The man was shaking now, which a nurse who came into her diner had once told her was actually a good sign. Shaking meant the body was still fighting. She peeled that soaked leather jacket off his shoulders because wet clothes freeze a man faster than no clothes at all. She hung it over the radiator, which hadn't kicked on in an hour because the boiler was struggling in the cold. She never checked the pockets. She never looked at the lining. If she had, she'd have found a folded patch, the kind sewn onto the back of a vest. Wings, a death's head, and 3 words that would have made most people in that city cross the street to get away from him. But Nora didn't look. She was too busy dragging her only spare blanket off her own bed and tucking it around a stranger. Then she went to the kitchen, lit the stove with a match because the pilot was out, and put her last container of soup on to heat. She was going to give away her tomorrow to a man whose name she didn't even know. And that soup, believe me, is going to matter more than she could possibly imagine. The soup came up to a simmer, and the cramped room finally started to smell like something other than wet wool. Nora crouched beside him with a spoon and a bowl. Getting a half-conscious man to eat is no small trick. She lifted his head onto her knee and pressed the spoon to his lips, and most of the first few tries just ran down into his beard. But she was patient. She'd fed her sick mother the same way once years back before the woman passed. You learn a rhythm, little sips. Wait, little sips. By the 4th spoonful his throat worked. He swallowed, and a sound came out of him, low and cracked, the first sound he'd made. "Where?" he said. That was all, just the one word. "You're safe," Nora told him. "You're out of the cold, you collapsed in my building, I couldn't leave you." She spooned in more soup. "Don't try to talk, just eat." His eyes came open then, just barely. Dark eyes, unfocused, swimming. They found her face and stayed there a second like he was trying to figure out if she was real. His lips moved again. She leaned close to catch it. "Why?" he whispered. "Not where this time. Why are you doing this?" Nora didn't have a fancy answer. She just said, "Because you were cold, now hush." His eyes closed. And here's the thing about that little exchange, the thing that mattered. A man who ran what he ran spent his whole life understanding exactly why people did things for him. Fear, money, debt, loyalty bought and paid for. Nobody had done a single thing for Cole Vantry in 30 years without wanting something back. And here was a woman with nothing, feeding him the last food in her house, and her only reason was that he was cold. He'd remember that. Even half frozen and half dreaming, some part of him would carry that answer out of the room. But that comes later. The night got worse before it got better. Around 2 in the morning his shaking turned violent, his teeth chattering so hard Nora was scared he'd break one. She did the only thing she could think of. She lay down on the floor on his other side, the way Biscuit had, and pressed herself against him to share what warmth her small body had. She pulled the blanket over all three of them. A waitress, a stranger, and a three-legged dog on the floor of a freezing walk-up while a blizzard screamed against the window. She talked to him softly in the dark, told him about the diner, told him about Biscuit, told him the plows would come at dawn and everything would be fine. She didn't know if he heard a word, but somewhere in there the shaking eased. His breathing went deep and even. And Nora, who'd worked a double and hauled a bear up 4 flights of stairs, finally lost the fight to stay awake. When she opened her eyes, gray light was coming through the window. The storm had broken, and the floor beside her was empty. She sat up fast. The blanket was folded, actually folded, in a neat square at the end where he'd lain. His jacket was gone from the radiator. Biscuit sat by the door with his one good ear up, staring at it, like he was waiting for someone to come back. Nora stood, confused, and that's when she saw the kitchen table. There was a small stack of bills on it. She counted with shaking fingers. $600, more cash than she'd held in a year, enough for the late rent and the next month and a full fridge besides. And underneath it, holding it down, was the empty soup container, rinsed clean and set upside down to dry the way you do in your own home. There was no note, no name, nothing. Nora walked to the window and looked down at the street 4 floors below. Snow everywhere, blinding white, unbroken except for one set of boot prints leading away from her door and around the corner already filling in. She watched until they were gone, and then she did what you do. She told herself a story that made sense. Poor fella down on his luck got caught in the storm. Good man underneath it, look, he left everything he had to say thank you. She said a little prayer that he'd get home safe wherever home was. She fed Biscuit. She made herself toast with the last of the bread. She sat down at the table with that impossible stack of money and let herself cry a little, the good kind, the relieved kind. The rent was covered. The nightmare was over. She thought it was the end of the story. She had no idea it was barely the beginning. For 3 days, life went quiet. The plows came through. The lines came back up. Nora paid her rent and watched her landlord's jaw drop when she handed him cash. She bought real groceries. She bought Biscuit a bag of the good food instead of the cheap stuff. She went back to her doubles and she told the story once to her friend Marisol behind the counter. And Marisol said, "Girl, you are lucky he wasn't some psycho." And Nora laughed and said, "He had kind eyes, and that was that." On the 4th morning, she was hanging her uniform to dry when she heard it. It started as a hum far off under the ordinary sounds of the street. Then it grew. It grew into a rumble, and the rumble grew into a roar, and the roar became a wall of sound that rattled the window glass in its frame. It wasn't one engine. It wasn't 10. It was dozens, all of them low and heavy and rolling closer, until the whole building seemed to shake with it. Nora went to the window. Motorcycles were coming down her street, a river of them, 2 by 2, headlights on in the gray morning, filling the road curb to curb as far back as she could see. Leather jackets, bearded men, and on the back of every single one, stitched large across the shoulders, the same patch, wings, a skull. She didn't need to read the words to know what she was looking at. Everyone in Buffalo knew what that patch meant. It meant the roughest, most feared motorcycle club in the state had just turned onto her block, and they were slowing down, right outside her building. Down on the street, 1 by 1, 40 engines cut off. The silence that dropped after all that noise was almost worse. Nora stood frozen at her window, watching men in black leather swing off their bikes and gather on the sidewalk below, looking up. Looking, it seemed, right at her building. Her first thought was pure panic. The money, the man, oh God, she thought. He robbed these people. He stole from them and hid in my apartment, and now they've traced him here and they think I helped. She backed away from the window, her heart hammering, and grabbed Biscuit by the collar as if a 3-legged dog could protect her from 40 bikers. There was a pounding on the street door downstairs, then boots on the stairs. Heavy, unhurried, a lot of them climbing. Her neighbors' doors clicked and chained. Mr. Petrosian's face appeared in his cracked doorway across the hall, white as a sheet, mouthing, "Get inside, get inside." She couldn't move. The boots reached her floor, and a man filled her hallway. He was maybe 60, built like a barrel, gray beard down to his chest. When he turned to speak to the others, Nora saw the word she'd been dreading stitched under the top rocker of his vest. President. He turned back to her, and his face, which looked like it had been carved out of a tree stump, did something unexpected. It went gentle. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was surprisingly soft. "Are you Nora Whitaker?" She couldn't get a word out. She just nodded, one hand still clamped on Biscuit's collar. "My name's Dutch," he said. "I'm the vice president of this charter, and I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. 4 nights ago in this storm, did you take a man in off your stairs? Big fella, half dead from the cold. Did you carry him up here and feed him?" Nora's mouth was dry as paper. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know who he was, I swear. He left the money. I didn't take anything from him, I didn't." Dutch held up one enormous hand, and she stopped. "Ma'am," he said, "that man is Cole Vantry. He's our president. He's been the president of this club for 11 years. He paused, and Nora watched this huge, terrifying man's eyes go wet at the rims. His bike went down on the interstate in the whiteout, threw him into the ditch. We lost his signal. For 3 days, 40 of us tore this city apart looking for our brother, and we'd started planning his funeral. We thought he was dead in a snowbank." He took a breath. "And then he walks into the clubhouse yesterday, frostbite on 2 fingers, but alive. Alive because some waitress he never met dragged 200 pounds of him up 4 flights and gave him the last food in her kitchen and never once asked his name or what was in his pockets." Dutch's voice cracked right down the middle. "You know what he told us? He said a woman who had nothing gave him everything. And he asked us why. Why would somebody do that?" Behind Dutch, filling the stairs, the leather-clad men stood silent, every one of them looking at this tiny woman in a doorway like she was something holy. And Nora, still not understanding, still braced for the worst, said the only thing she'd said to Cole that night. Because he was cold. Nobody moved. Then Dutch laughed, a wet, broken laugh, and wiped his face with the back of his hand. "Yeah," he said, "that's exactly what he figured you'd say. I want to stop here for 1 second, because this is the moment the whole thing turned. Everything Nora feared was wrong. These men hadn't come to hurt her. They'd come because their leader was alive, and the only reason he was alive was her. And that changes everything about what happens next. If you're still with me, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Stories like this one, real kindness, the kind that comes back around when you least expect it, that's what this whole channel is about, and I've got a lot more of them coming. Now let's get back to Nora, because the man on the stairs isn't finished, and the biggest surprise is still coming up those 4 flights. Dutch stepped aside, and that's when Nora saw him, the stranger. Cole Vantry climbing the last flight slower than the rest, favoring one side. He looked different now, cleaned up, warm, dressed in his colors, that vest with the president's rockers on it. His 2 frostbitten fingers were taped, but the eyes were the same. She'd have known those eyes anywhere. Kind eyes. She'd told Marisol he had kind eyes, and here they were. He stopped in front of her. This man who commanded 40 of the hardest people in the state. And he did something none of them had ever seen him do to anyone. He got down on one knee. "Ma'am," Cole said, "I don't remember much of that night, but I remember your face over me, and I remember you telling me I was safe. I remember a spoon. I remember a dog." He glanced down, and Biscuit, who trusted no strangers, hopped forward and pushed his head into Cole's hand like they were old friends. Cole's throat moved. "And I remember asking you why. You want the truth. Nobody in my whole life ever gave me an answer like yours." People do things for me because they're scared of me or they want something off me. You did it because I was cold. That's it. That's the only reason." He looked up at her. "I've done a lot of things I'm not proud of, but I know what it costs a person to give away their last when they've got nothing. And you did it for a stranger. So now every single one of us owes you a debt, and this club pays its debts." Nora finally found her voice. "You already paid me. The money. It was too much. That was rent," Cole said. "That wasn't the debt." He stood slow and turned to the men on the stairs, and his voice changed. It got hard and clear, and it carried down 4 flights. "You all know why we're here. Let's get to work." And then, believe me, the strangest morning of Nora Whitaker's life truly began. 40 bikers went to work on her building. She stood in her doorway and couldn't make sense of any of it. 2 men were down in the basement with the landlord, who came up 20 minutes later looking dazed and told her the boiler that had been dying for 2 winters was being replaced today at no cost to anyone, because one of the club members owned a heating company and had a truck full of parts on the way. The radiators banged and hissed, and for the first time in a year, real heat rolled into her rooms. Out in the hall, a rider with tattoos up to his jaw was on his knees fixing the street door that never latched, the one that had let the storm in and let a dying man freeze on the tile. Another was up a ladder replacing every dead bulb in the stairwell. Someone was carrying up groceries, bag after bag after bag, filling her tiny kitchen until the counters disappeared, until there was more food in that apartment than Nora had seen in her whole adult life. "I can't take all this," she kept saying. "This is too much, I can't." And Cole, watching from a chair she'd made him sit in because he was still weak, kept saying the same thing back. "You don't get a vote on this one, ma'am. You lost your vote when you carried me up the stairs." But here's what got her. It wasn't the boiler or the food or the money. Around noon, a younger rider came up carrying something wrapped in a blanket, and he set it down careful on her floor, and it was a bed. A real bed, a good one, still in its wrapping, because one of them had walked into a furniture store that morning and pointed and paid cash. And Nora looked at that bed and thought about how she'd given her only spare blanket to a stranger and slept on the floor beside him, and something in her just came apart. She sat down on her new mattress and put her face in her hands and cried the way you cry when the world surprises you by being good. Cole eased himself down beside her, careful of his ribs. He didn't touch her, he just sat. "I want to tell you something," he said quietly, while the noise of 40 men fixing her home went on around them. "I grew up in a house where nobody had anything. My mother worked nights like you. She used to bring home whatever the restaurant threw out, and one winter we had a man living in our garage because he'd have died otherwise, and my old man wanted to throw him out, and my mother stood in the doorway and said the exact words you said to me. He was cold. What are you going to do, let him freeze?" Cole shook his head slowly. "I forgot that woman. I built a whole life being hard because hard was the only thing that kept you alive where I'm from. And then I wake up in a stranger's apartment with a 3-legged dog on my chest, and I hear my mother's voice coming out of your mouth." He was quiet a second. "You didn't just save my life on those stairs, Nora. You reminded me I used to be somebody's kid who believed people were worth saving. I'd lost that a long time ago." Nora wiped her face. "You keep calling it a debt," she said. "It wasn't a debt. I'd have done it for anyone." "I know," Cole said. "That's the whole point. That's why it counts." There was one more thing. Late that afternoon, when most of the work was done and the men were filing back down to their bikes, Dutch came up the stairs holding a small square of leather. He handed it to Cole, and Cole turned it over in his taped-up hands, and Nora recognized it. It was the patch from inside his jacket, the one she'd never looked at. Wings and a skull, worn soft at the edges from years of being carried. "This rode inside my cut for a long time," Cole said. "It's the first one I ever wore back when I was nobody. I don't give these to people. I've given exactly none of them away in 11 years. He pressed it into her hand and closed her fingers over it. "You ever need anything, anything at all, day or night, you show that to any rider wearing our colors anywhere in this state and they will move heaven and earth for you. That's not a favor. That's a promise from 40 men who thought their brother was dead in the snow and got him back because of you. Your family now, whether you asked for it or not." Nora looked down at the patch in her hand. She thought about the folded thing in the jacket she'd hung on the radiator and never once inspected. She thought about how, if she'd looked, if she'd known who he was, she might have been afraid. She might have locked the door. She might have left him in the cold, and she was so glad she hadn't looked. The snow melted, eventually, the way it always does. Spring came to Buffalo, late and muddy, and life on Seneca Street went back to something like normal, but not quite, never quite. Because now, on the slow nights at the diner, a couple of leather-jacketed men would come in and take the back booth and tip Nora more than the whole night's other tables combined, and they'd call her ma'am, and they'd walk her to her door when her shift ended after midnight so she never again had to make that dark walk home alone. The building had heat now, real heat, all winter. The street door latched. The stairwell was lit. And nobody but nobody gave Nora Whittaker any trouble on her block ever again. She kept the patch in a drawer by her bed. She never had to use it. Just knowing it was there was enough. Cole came back once on his own in the spring, knocked on her door like a regular person. He brought a proper bag of the good dog food for Biscuit, who greeted him like a long-lost brother, hopping in circles on his 3 legs. Cole sat at her table, the same table where he'd left $600 and an empty soup container, and drank the coffee she made him, and for a while they didn't talk about that night at all. They talked about ordinary things, the diner, his fingers which had healed, the weather. Before he left, he stood in her doorway and looked back at the small, warm room. "You know," he said, "everybody in my world spends their whole life trying to look strong, trying to make sure nobody ever sees them weak. And I spent 3 days lost in a storm, weaker than I've ever been in my life, at the total mercy of whoever found me first." He paused. "It could have been anybody. It could have been somebody who'd have gone through my pockets and left me for dead. Instead, it was you. 100 pounds soaking wet, and you carried me up 4 flights because I was cold." He shook his head. "I've been strong my whole life and it never once made me safe. You were soft and you saved my life. I'm still turning that one over." Nora thought about it a moment. Then she said, "It wasn't strong or soft. It was just the right thing. You do the right thing when it's in front of you. That's all there is to it." Cole smiled at that, a real smile, the kind that took years off his hard face. "Yeah," he said, "my mother would have liked you." And then he went down the 4 flights and out the door that now latched behind him, and Nora heard his single engine start up in the street and roll away into the evening. Here's what I keep coming back to, and I think it's why this story stays with people. Nora Whittaker never asked his name. She never looked at the patch. She never once weighed whether the man was worth saving, whether he could pay her back, whether he was safe or dangerous or connected or alone. She just saw a person freezing on cold tile and she couldn't live with walking past. That's it. That's the whole thing. A woman with nothing gave everything she had, expecting nothing back. And because of that, and only because of that, 40 of the most feared men in the state came rolling down her street not to take, but to give. To fix a boiler. To fill a fridge. To fix a door so no one else would ever freeze where their brother almost did. We spend so much time asking whether people deserve our kindness, whether they've earned it, whether they'll take advantage. Nora didn't ask any of that. She just knelt down in the dark and pulled. That night in the stairwell, she thought she was giving away her last container of soup to a stranger who'd be gone by morning. She had no idea she was making the safest, warmest, most protected years of her whole life. She had no idea her three-legged dog had just chosen her a family. She had no idea that the simplest thing a person can do, keeping another human being from freezing to death, would echo back to her 40 engines strong. She just knew he was cold. And that was enough. That was always enough. So the next time you see somebody down on their luck, somebody easy to step over, somebody it would be so simple to walk past, remember the waitress on the 4th floor who weighed 110 pounds and dragged a stranger up the stairs anyway. You never know who you're saving. And you never, ever know what's going to come rolling back down your street to say thank you. Take care of each other out there. I'll see you in the next one. Tighten to 4,986 words, inside your 4,805-200 target. The hook is verbatim, the ending is intact, and every beat survives. The trims came from doubled phrasing, a few redundant asides and compressed connective sentences, e.g., merging the sir, discovery lines, the Dutch basement paragraph, and the closing reflection. Want me to trim further toward a hard 4,950, or leave it here?